Welcome everyone back to the CannMed Coffee Talk Lounge here at CannMed 2022. I'm your host, Ben Ameralt, host of the CannMed Coffee Talk podcast. And I have Seth Crawford here joining me in the Coffee Talk Lounge, our cultivation keynote presenter. Seth, good to see you.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. And how nice is it to be back at an in-person event here at CannMed? And what are you looking to get out of the event?
Pretty excited about it. This is the first time that we've gone to a conference in 3 years. Very, very excited about a number of the presentations. Just really excited to see what's happened in 3 years. There's been an absolute, just obvious decline in public events, and this is going to be a great chance to reconnect with a lot of people that were not necessarily even in the story 3 years ago.
Right.
So it's very exciting.
Yeah, and you mentioned presentations that you're looking forward to. What are some of those?
Really looking forward to Keith Allen's talk on terpenes,
Nice.
Jordan Zager's talk on sort of the whole pantheon of how to create good cannabis for consumers. Stoked about Kevin McKernan's talk on psilocybin. We played a small role in that and doing some of the early sequencing work, so we're very excited to see what direction that's gone. And to be perfectly honest, I'm very excited, probably the most excited, to see Alicia Holloway talking about THCV breeding efforts with Phylos. And the reason I'm excited about it is I can't wait to see how people react to Phylos. Just leave it at that.
Yeah, and THCV, you have some experience breeding that as well.
A lot. So THCV is identical to CBDV, CBGV, CBCV, et cetera, in terms of the precursor chemicals. So what that presentation is really going to be about are the underlying genomic regions of interest that make varin production possible. The findings are going to be interesting because it's probably going to be the same thing that we found. And we did that with the SNP chip along with Eurofins and in Medicinal Genomics about 2 years ago to identify different chromosomes that had associations with that particular trait. It's polygenic, it's spread across at least 6 different chromosomes, very difficult from a breeding perspective. The title of her talk is about THCV, but the real underlying information is about those precursor genes that allow all of the other cannabinoids to happen. So we've been doing identical parallel research, so very curious to see what they found.
Excellent. And it's interesting you say that. And if I understand this correctly, so it's the same enzymes or the same pathways creating THCA or THCV. It's just that precursor molecule that's different?
So the gene responsible for THC production is the same gene that makes THCV.
Right.
So it's a THCAS, and the same thing's true with CBDAS, CBCAS, and on the underlying CBGAS on chromosome X that's responsible for creating all the precursors in general. But you're just looking at 2 different metabolic pathways, one that's pentyl, one that's propyl, with different upstream regulation. Both of our research has basically been looking at the propyl version of that, looking at the upstream components.
Okay. And so what is the importance of THCV, or what is the potential use for it?
We were using it to help farmers get around some of the regulatory requirements with industrial hemp production because THCV, when it's in the plant, is not part of the 0.3 total THC that's allowed. And so we can basically create higher cannabinoid content plants that have both CBD and CBDV in the fraction while reducing the total amount of THC. From a medical perspective, I'm really not an expert on that, but the people who are studying it have looked at a number of different potential applications, specifically related to the things that are interesting to me anyway, looking at diabetes and potential help with insulin resistance. So that's absolutely fascinating to me. Really, it's about making these compounds available. THCV has not been available widely, neither is CBDV or CBGV. Getting these into people's hands is really what's going to tell us what they're effective in treating.
Excellent. Okay, so as we mentioned, you're a keynote presenter, and the title of your talk is Cannabis 2022, the Golden Year of Discovery. Now, back when you first signed on to be the keynote presenter, that was going to be CannMed 2020, and that was the title of your talk, was Cannabis 2020, the Golden Year of Discovery. So I guess what has happened in those 2 years, and how are you going to cram that all into a 1-hour presentation?
So much information, and quite honestly, busted, right? I just recycled the same title. And the underlying reality here is that cannabis as a plant doesn't really give a damn about social constructs. Years are the same to the plant, it doesn't matter. If it's still alive and able to grow, it's the golden year for the plant itself. And I think being able to look at this from the perspective of plants rather than from the human perspective is sometimes enlightening in terms of the way that we look at the world. It's not so much about social constructs as it is understanding that just being able to have these plants available to us and being able to use them is probably one of the best times to be alive in this country. But in terms of real research that has happened in the last 3 years, we were shooting in the dark in 2018. We were doing things basically through brute force approaches that a lot of the genomic and more technical tools have allowed us to do away with. And so it's rapidly expanded our ability to breed, make selections when plants are seedlings rather than full-grown plants. I mean, it's just incredible in terms of the amount of discovery that's happened in the last 3 years.
Yeah. And I know that when we've spoken in the past, one of the, at least what you said, one of the main reasons that your company focuses on hemp is because, you know, obviously the regulations around how much cannabis you can grow, where there's fewer restrictions on hemp, so you can do sort of these large-scale breeding projects. So as you mentioned, some of these genomic tools that can, you know, maybe reduce your footprint, you don't have to have so many plants. Is there any chance you could be steering into cannabis instead of hemp?
It's all the same. So to answer it coyly, yes. We're going to have an announcement tomorrow. We are entering the THC breeding space.
Excellent.
That's going to be a little bit of the final part of the presentation.
Wow, exclusive.
And it's a very, this is the place to release it. This is a great conference, and you know, there's a number of people that are making significant waves in the industry, and we'd love to be able to share that information. There have been, in the last 3 months, some dramatic changes at the federal level in terms of policy that, with a few LLCs and some other legal approaches that allow us to basically get into the THC market. So we're really excited to be able to offer triploids and tetraploid seed varieties for THC growers around the country.
Wow, yeah, that is exciting.
Super exciting.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess to kind of go back to that, and I know it's an issue in the universities as well, where a lot of universities, they're starting hemp programs, but it is restricted to hemp. And as you mentioned, it is pretty much the same plant. It's just sort of that 0.3 THC designation. But, you know, is there some differences there? Are some of these universities kind of missing out on some, you know, potential discoveries because they're only focused on hemp?
No, because the only thing that makes a chemical difference in the plant is a single gene on chromosome 7, for the most part. So any of the other elements that are on chromosome 7, we're going to talk a little bit about that tomorrow, they could potentially be something we're missing out on, because there's not a lot of recombination that happens between the chromosomes. The universities themselves at this point have basically, and this is the great part of the 2018 Farm Bill, they have been allowed relatively free reign, and it really comes down to their risk assessment. Certain universities have been very risk avoidant and have not gone into more, I'd say, exhaustive surveys of what's available. Other universities have. Cornell's a really good example of that in my mind, in that they were willing to engage in field trials from 2018 on of any germplasm that people were willing to submit for industrial hemp. And the reality was, they've got a couple of really good publications out of this, was that there were a lot of people who were just doing poor breeding. They didn't understand the underlying mechanisms that allowed people to grow CBD dominant varieties and still have it be considered hemp under the federal guidelines. So they were submitting type 2 plants and type 1 plants in a lot of cases that were, you know, 8 to 12 to 15% THC. And the moral of the story here is that the world didn't end. Cornell grew these plants, they assessed them, and they said, hey, farmers need to be aware that people are selling stuff that will get them put in jail. That was a huge public service, and should definitely be applauded, whereas other universities have not gone that route. So, in summary, universities are working with cannabis, and it's actually fairly revolutionary. It hasn't happened in a very long time, and there's great research results coming out of it.
Yeah, that's exciting. I did want to mention something that I read in your abstract, and you say that you talk about the long-standing promise of the plant in food, fiber, medicine, and unknown unknowns. And so why do you believe hemp has not really lived up to its billing as this super crop that can replace all these other crops? Because it seems like most of the cultivation's been focused on cannabinoids.
It really has. And to be honest, I think a lot of this has to do with the history of people making really expansive promises based on very little data. So a lot of the research that people were looking at in terms of grain, looking at, like supercapacitors out of hemp fiber, great research, really, really interesting. It got people thinking that hemp could do a million different things, and it can, but the reality is that the actual fundamental research that's required to bring those things to fruition hasn't occurred. And at the same time, many of the things that were overpromised essentially are not going to materialize in the US. Grain and fiber crops are not competitive economically in the US compared to Canada, China, or France, other major producers that have been doing this for a number of years. But at the end of the day, it may not matter, because some of the research that's now being done, a great one done at Oregon State this past year on using industrial hemp grain and fiber as a food source for animals, for livestock. This is going to allow small farmers to feed their animals in a more efficient way based off of a crop that's actually produced right there in their backyard. So I think the way that we need to think about it should change, rather than looking at it as some sort of economic driver that's going to make everybody a billionaire and the world's going to be driving around hemp-infused cars. We really need to look at the actual practical applications of what we can do with this plant and how we can leverage its plasticity to help farmers and other people who can actually use it. So,
excellent.
There's a bright future out there.
Yeah, I know, it sounds like it. All right, so in wrapping up here, just curious to get your thoughts that, given that a lot of this research, although we talked about the universities are getting back into it, but still a lot of the research being done into this plant is by privately funded companies. And with that said, maybe speak to the importance of coming to an event like CannMed and sharing that information with the community instead of kind of keeping it close to the vest. I mean, obviously you got to keep some things for yourself, but
it's really hard. To be honest, I understand where a lot of these companies are coming from. The cannabis marketplace, for as much economic benefit and as much of an impact as it has, most producers are really having a hard time staying in business. Yeah. Suppliers of technical equipment are having a hard time, helping the hemp market out. They're having a hard time dealing with the cannabis market. It's just constantly in flux. Where we go from there is going to be largely determined by the way that we deal with that data. And I personally view data as essentially like, it's money. It's something that took money to create, but it's also not something that as companies, we're going to be able to do anything with when we're gone. And so what is the point in hoarding that data and not being able to make it public? Something that we find that we may have questions about when it goes out to collaborators or to the general public, other scientists, maybe they have an idea about how to fix that or how to do something more unique with it. We can come up with all kinds of ideas, but at the end of the day, it's not what we do, it's what other people are able to do with it that ends up having the lasting legacy. And we're more concerned about being able to push science forward and to be able to make this plant more accessible to as many people as possible without getting caught up with money. And it's the unfortunate reality of life in general, but we're doing whatever we can to get around that.
All right, well, Seth, we're glad to have you here at CannMed.
Thanks for having me.
For another year, and thanks for joining us in the Coffee Talk Lounge. And hope you have a great event.
You as well. Thank you very much.